Hello, welcome to Inside Ministry. This is a live weekly program that highlights the people and the partners of the Continuing Communion and explores how their ministries are impacting the communities they touch and the world around them. The goal of the program is to encourage you with the stories of CEEC ministry in action, to equip you by giving you a first-hand look at how others are fulfilling their calling and providing a platform where you can ask your questions and learn new answers, and also to engage you in the life of the Continuing Communion by building relationships with folks connected to the CEEC from all over the world. Hi, I'm Bishop Robert, and I'll be your host for tonight's program. Our guest tonight is Father Dominick Hankle. He leads From Emmaus to Jerusalem, a ministry in the Virginia Beach area. It's a group of followers who are being renewed, restored, and recreated through the Holy Spirit. Father Dominick holds a PhD in general psychology, and he chairs the psychology department at Regent University, where he also has the CEEC involved in campus ministry and celebrations of the Eucharist and running a home church. So make sure to add your thoughts and your reactions to the chat window during the interview. We're going to have a lot of tough conversations going on and some great insight from Father Dominick, who is a counselor and a psychologist, and we're also going to highlight some of them later in the program. So the chat window is also the place for you to add your questions, and as always, during the latter portion of the program, we'll be posing many of them to Father Dominick to get his response. Father Dominick maintains an extensive practice as a therapist, working mostly with couples, children, and adults, as well as ministry, providing pastoral services to a number of churches and even a nursing home. He's written extensively on the topics of leadership, forgiveness, and spiritual discernment, and we're going to draw on that extensive experience tonight as we discuss discernment and forgiveness in the light of the national unrest that we've all seen in the wake of George Floyd's death while in police custody 2 weeks ago. So buckle up, we're in for one amazing hour. Father Dominick, welcome to Inside Ministry. We're so glad to have you with us.
Thank you, Archbishop. It's great to be here. I'm really glad to do so.
This is going to be a wild and crazy hour, brother, because we're going to be touching on a lot of topics that people have been talking about and wrestling through and just dealing with for the last couple of weeks. We've seen a lot of unrest in our nation, and we're talking about tonight holistic spiritual discernment. First of all, finding the truth. Second of all, defeating the lie, and that's actually a second different step, because it's one thing to know the truth and it's another thing to overcome the lie, but we also want to talk about living the power. And so that's going to kind of be the theme as we work through this evening. Now, you talk about, on the website for Emmaus to Jerusalem Ministries, you talk about a sacred space and making a sacred space. Mm-hmm. These last 2 weeks have been a kind of turbulent time around the United States. We've had large, often violent protests in several major cities, actually not just major cities, not so major cities. Thousands of Virginians marched in largely peaceful gatherings, which I thought was interesting because Virginia Beach has a significantly larger black population than the U.S. average. 20% in Virginia Beach versus about 13.5% in the U.S. Has that made a difference in Virginia Beach? What's Virginia Beach been like these last couple of weeks?
Surprisingly, we've had our issues, right? The ocean front had some difficulties. And when we talk about Virginia Beach, usually for us, we're talking about what we call the Hampton Roads area. So Virginia Beach itself is one city of a number of cities like Williamsburg, Hampton, Norfolk. We've actually fared pretty good, I think, considering what we've seen in other places. And Archbishop, sometimes I look at that and I think Virginia Beach and the Hampton Roads area also has a lot of churches. There's a real big faith experience here in this part of the world. And I really do think that, that of course infuses the spirit into what is going on all over the country. I really do.
Well, I appreciate you unpacking that sentiment that you've been seeing in the city. You bring up the churches and the impact of the churches. What involvement has the church had, whether it's your church or some of the other churches that are there? How do you create that sacred space to bring about the dialogue and the healing?
Yeah, well, I think and this goes back to who we are as Christians, right? What are we? And I love that passage where Jeremiah tells those that are sent off to Babylon that rebuild the city, right? You rebuild the city, marry there, thrive there. And that really echoes what the Christian life is. Think about it. I mean, we are renewed. We are actually citizens of another world. We're citizens of another kingdom. But our job here is to bring that presence, right? That kingdom living wherever we go. And so what I think you see happening when you have more Christians in an area, more of that kingdom living, that kingdom experience eases its way out into whatever area we're at. And that's creating the sacred space. We just had a prayer walk, I think it was the other night, over in Norfolk. And even some of the folks I know that come to my little church community, they were there. And they prayed and they walked and they marched and they proclaimed that, all of this division, this is not kingdom living. And what it means to live as a kingdom people is to seek peace, is to seek the benefit of others, is to find what is true and to hold on to what is true. And I think I see that in our area, and it does my heart good, because it could get bad here. It really could get bad here. But no, I'm seeing more good than I am bad. And this speaks to the sacramental nature of who we are, right? I mean, we are incarnational. We are the presence of God working through us wherever we go. And when we do that, that helps create the sacred space. And particularly when you get 2 or 3 Christians who come together, their God is, right? The scripture teaches us that. It creates that sacred space where the Spirit can find its way into the smallest cracks in the hardest hearts that are surrounding it. So I think we're seeing some of that. At least that's my hope, that we're seeing some of that.
Have you heard any stories from church people about interactions they've had and discussions they've had and how they've been able to sort of break down those barriers and build those bridges?
Yeah, just in fact, I was talking to someone today that was at that prayer walk, and so they made a sign that they wanted to carry, and this was a white individual, and the other individual had the post, and together they made one sign, and both of them carried it, right? So here's a black white Christian carrying a sign calling out for the justice and peace that Jesus brings. So it's stuff like that just reminds me of how good God is and how He can, God isn't for one people; He is for all people who accept Him and come into His relationship with Him. That's the beauty of Christianity. We're not a faith of one particular people. We're a faith of all people who will come under the kingdom of Christ.
Amen. And in Christ there is no male or female, Jew or Greek, slave or free. We are one in Christ. We come into the body of Christ, and He is our head. And there's a unity there, an organic unity that cannot be found in any other place.
No, not at all.
I didn't see that image of the black person and the white person sharing the sign walking down the street as I was looking at the different media. And media is a big driver of emotion. And obviously some of the news is fake news, and that seems to be aimed at stirring those emotions. And we've spoken about, finding the truth and defeating the lie. I mean, last week I saw the Richmond Times-Dispatch, which is a Virginia newspaper for folks who don't know about Richmond, claimed in an article that law enforcement is disproportionately arresting black people. And they were claiming that the black arrest rate is 68 per thousand, while the white arrest rate is only 26 per thousand. But that just isn't so. I mean, the FBI's national crime statistics show that out of 7.7 million arrests last year, 3.3 million were against white people, and 2.1 million were against black people. And this push of information and misinformation and stirring the pot is it's raising up emotions that are clouding the whole issue of discussion. How do you help people find the truth and defeat the lie in that kind of a circumstance?
Well, here's the biggest problem. The first one is most people don't study psychology or the social sciences and understand statistics. I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen. I know many of you out there have studied your disciplines, but one of the benefits you get from studying either the social sciences or psychology is you understand statistics. So when you talk about those numbers from Richmond, what population does that 1,000 come from? Well, if it's from the Richmond area, you most likely will have a higher number of black arrests because there are more African Americans in the District of Richmond, right?
Mm-hmm.
In the crime statistics for the U.S., what crimes are you talking about, right? More white people will commit crimes like larceny, okay, or what we call white-collar crimes. More white men are mass killers, right? Serial killers.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so you can't compare those populations and get a good answer. So most people don't think, they immediately react on the statistic they hear. We cannot say there is not an implicit bias towards African Americans. You cannot.
Right.
We've done enough research in psychology. If you're interested in this, you can do a Google search, look up something called the Implicit Association Test. And what we have found, white people and African Americans and black people both have a positive bias towards the white culture and a negative bias towards the African American culture. And the way they test that is they'll put up a word that's negative and then a face of an African American or a white person, and then they check how quickly you say which is good and which is bad. It's an interesting test. I think it comes out of Harvard. And statistics show all the time there's a negative bias towards that community. And this is just part of living in a culture where we have had something like slavery in the past. It's just part of it. Does that mean it has to remain that way? I don't think so. I think, of course, in Christ, all things can be transformed. So the first thing I want to say is we cannot say there is no such thing as a bias, which means white officers probably are not consciously targeting African Americans, but they are dealing with the situation where they may look more quickly to what's going on there with that population. And Archbishop, you can see it in my neighborhood. If me and a number of the neighbors are sitting around talking and an African American young kid comes walking up the street, immediately you see people go on guard. You see it, and I'm a people watcher as a psychologist. Now, he might be playing music that we old people don't like. It could be a lot of things. But you take a young white kid doing the same kind of thing, that guard isn't up, okay? So set that aside. That's truth. That's something that's there. Right. That's part of our sin nature. Whenever we identify someone as the other, our sin nature says, beware, right? However, like you said, statistics, I don't like to say statistics lie, but people are not real smart with statistics, so they can be used to manipulate others. I'll give you a good example. We use this in some of my classes. If I ask you to pick one of these two surgeries, you tell me which you would pick. I would say I have a surgery where of 100 people undergoing that surgery, 90 of them will live through the post-operation period, 68 are alive at the end of the first year, and 34 are alive at the end of the fifth year, okay? That's the first surgery. The second one, of the 100 people undergoing surgery, 10 will die during the surgery, okay? 32 will die by the end of the first year, and 66 by the end of the fifth year. And I'll say to my students, which one would you choose? And of course, they pick the first one. If you look at the numbers I gave you, it's the same numbers.
It's the same numbers.
They add up to the thing, right? But most people don't think it through, right? And that's, again, not using discernment, not being a critical thinker. So I think you're right. The media knows that, and they build off that with us, and everybody creates a narrative. We like to talk about facts in our world, but the truth is we like narratives as people. Every organization I've ever belonged to has a narrative. The key is, does your narrative reflect what is true, right? And that's why I think God didn't just give us facts about himself. He didn't come down and say, okay, I'm omnipotent, I'm all present. Here's all the things about me you need to know. What did God do? He gave us a story.
Right.
The Bible is salvation history. It's a beautiful narrative about a God who loves us, comes to dwell with us, and lifts up our humanity to be what it was created to be, right? Not to just leave it down in the shallow dirt of sin. And so I think people are drawn to narrative, and when that narrative says what's not true, they'll buy into it. And we're seeing that. That's what we're seeing.
And he didn't also not give us a list of qualities and characteristics. He came and he lived among us. He gave a relationship, and he loved us. So listen, as you're listening to Father Dominick speak, I'm sure you're having questions pop up. I'm sure that you're hearing some of the things that may be getting you happy, maybe getting you frustrated. Post some questions on the social media. We're going to come to answer them a little bit later in the program, but we want to get your insight and we want to get your feelings as well. So go ahead and start posting those questions and comments now. Father Dominick, tell us from the psychological perspective, you were just talking about people hiding things, people twisting things, and yet you were also talking about those people in your front yard with just the reaction of seeing that young black person walking up the street and getting a reaction. How do we begin to identify these sort of things, these blind spots of character, so we can see more clearly?
Oh, that's a great question. You're talking about ourselves. How do we ourselves notice that? Yeah, I mean, and that's where discernment comes in. We need to step back and be discerning people. And if you don't mind, let me share a little bit about my vision of discernment. I really came to this in an interesting way. So I had been pursuing my PhD in psychology, and you have to do a dissertation, obviously. Right. And I thought of all these topics. Now, I had already been through seminary, so I had a theology degree behind me. I had a counseling degree. And I thought, okay, I was at a secular school, so what topic should I pick? And so I went down this long list, and finally, they kept saying no. My advisor kept saying no to everything. I finally said, I'll tell you what I'm interested in if you really want to know. I was frustrated, and if you've ever been to graduate school, that's really just, it's just like academic abuse. It gives people a license to abuse you for 4 or 5 years. So I said, here's what I really want to do. I'm interested in what are the psychological processes someone goes through when they decide to go into ministry. And I thought, they're going to throw that one out, right? Especially at the time, I was real interested because I myself was Roman Catholic, and it was during the period when all of the sex scandals started to blow up. And I used to think to myself, who would want to be a minister knowing that this is going on? And of all things, my advisor said, that's perfect. We're going to do that one. And I said to him, are you sure? He goes, yeah, I'm really interested in that. I think that'll do well. And I said to him, can I ask why? He says, well, I'm an Orthodox Jew, and I love religious questions, and this would be great. And he and I forged a friendship, and I did that dissertation on discernment, and it did rather well. But the point I try and make in my dissertation is you have to have a proper anthropology of human beings to discern well. And I see two extremes. I see people who see discernment as just going through the cognitive psychological process to make a decision, and then based on that, I make my decision. But the church is actually guilty of hyper-spiritualizing discernment. You get those people who sit and they're in the spirit and they pray, and God told me to do this, and this is what I'm going to do, so I'm going to go off and do it. So you got hyper-spiritualization on one side and what I call super-reductionism of people to the other side. So we're either just spirits or we're brains on a stick. And neither of those are what people are. So what I propose is if you look at a biblical understanding of people, first of all, we were created with bodies. God intends us to have bodies. When Christ comes again, we will be with bodies. We are not just souls. We are bodies and souls united together. So what does the body have to say about discernment? A gut feeling. You know when something's bothering. Your body speaks to you. You get these, we call them in psychology, psychosomatic senses. So when that young black man's walking up the street, you get a psychosomatic sense. You get nervous. You get tense. You need to ask yourself, why is that happening? But don't just react on that, because that's just one element of discernment. You also do have a brain. The good Lord created us with reason. In fact, many of the church fathers talked about that rational principle of a human being reflects God, because God is rational. God puts things in order. So that's the second part. Are you reasoning well? Are you not being fooled by, there's a lot of psychological traps that can get you. For instance, confirmation bias. Unconsciously, we often seek evidence to support what we already believe rather than what challenges it. Okay? That's the second thing, cognitively. Emotions. We are not Mr. Spock. And in fact, Mr. Spock would be an awful discerner because he disregards emotions. Your emotions are very important, particularly when you're doing moral decision-making. Your emotions give you that sense that this is not right, and so you need to follow that. So we've got our bodies, our minds, our emotions. Then the other one most people forget is relationships. God created us relationships. We reflect the Trinity. He is within himself a communion of love. So individuals, when they're discerning something, they need to talk to the trusted individuals God's placed in their life. Is this something I should be doing? Should I be feeling this? When someone is being... a young black man's walking up, I should look at other people. How are they reacting to this, right? Together, let's discern this. And then the last one, of course, we are spiritual. We are transcendent creatures, and God speaks to us spiritually. So when we discern anything to know if it's true, we need to look at how our bodies are reacting. Are they in the best of shape to make decisions? Because, if you don't eat, if you don't take care of your body, it impacts your decision-making. Are our minds clear? Are we avoiding those psychological traps that plague us? Are my emotions in tune with what's going on? What is my emotion saying to me about this situation? And then, of course, what are other people, other believers, other trusted souls in my life? What are they saying about this or about what I'm thinking? Finally, do I hear God's voice speaking to my spirit about this? And that's when you know, when you're hearing that message, then you know you should move forward. If there's conflict, you need to work that out. And that works out in so many ways, whether it's getting yourself physically well or spiritually mature, one of those two. So I think people really want to know what's going on around them. If they want to, they need to step back. Now, I guess you got me on my soapbox. My biggest complaint right now is discernment requires a stepping back and listening, right? We need to listen to other people. And what's the first thing everybody in the world did as soon as all this stuff came up? Everybody had to make a statement. Every church had to have their bishops make a statement. Every industry had to come out and say who they support and why they support it. Every politician's up there talking. Nobody is listening. And if you're not listening, you're doing two things. You can't discern if you're not listening, and the people that need to get their message out are being quieted just by the mass amount of stuff that's being said. So I really would encourage everybody, step back, use that holistic discernment, and try and understand where God is leading us through this.
Right. It's interesting you point that out. I just have to tell you, the CEEC did not make a statement. We didn't put Archbishop John or myself. Now, I was meeting with people, black and white. I was having conversations. I was listening. Many of our bishops were. But our statement is in how we live and how we act and what we do. And so we decided we're not making some sort of public statement. And I used to travel a lot. I used to spend close to 230 days or more a year on the road, and had the privilege of spending about 6 months a year in Israel for 10 years. But you get on the airplane, and those of you who've traveled, you've all gone through this. You've got everything has to go in the overhead bin, or it has to go underneath the seat in front of you. And I heard the story about the person was holding something in their lap. They figured it was going to be safe. It was just small, whatever. And the flight attendant came along and said, sir, that's good. You're going to have to stow that, overhead. Or he said, no, I'm just going to hold on to it. It's going to be fine. She says, no, it's not going to be fine. It's going to go overhead. He said, it's just whatever it was. I'm not going to worry about it. And the flight attendant said, sir, until you deal with your baggage, the plane's not going anywhere.
Ooh, what a metaphor.
And I heard that, and I think, you know what? We've got to deal with our baggage. If we want the church to move forward, if we want to go someplace and have an impact, we've got to deal with our baggage. And you mentioned talking to that trusted person. Excuse me. Part of the issue of dealing with things that are blind spots for us is, by definition, we can't see our blind spots. But the people who are closest to us, they can see our blind spots and they can make us aware of them. And if we have a trusted relationship and someone is telling us about a blind spot in our life, then we need to be able to deal with that. I think that's one of the ways we're going to get rid of our baggage so we can take off together. Tell us your story. When did Christ invade the life of Dominick Hankle and make a difference?
Yes. God and I don't get along very well, Bishop. I don't know if that's good to confess that or not. So I'm from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania originally, born and raised. I'm very proud of that. It's a good blue-collar working class town. I was raised by Italian immigrants. My mother's from Italy, and my father is a hardworking blue-collar 101st Airborne Ranger Pittsburgh police officer. So
wow, that's hardcore.
Yes, it doesn't get any more blue-collar than that. And if you're Catholic, or if you're in Pittsburgh and you're Italian, you're Roman Catholic. Okay?
That's right.
And my dad, I pray that he is with the Lord. He had an interesting walk. I mean, this is very typical of a man with his background. I do believe he had faith, but he wouldn't show it much. He said that the only reason we talk about God is to keep people from killing one another. That's the police officer in him. But my mother was very faithful. The Italian side was very faithful. Even my dad's parents were very faithful. So I grew up in the Catholic tradition. Unfortunately, what it became more for us was a cultural thing than an actual lived experience. And that's not any fault with the Roman Catholic Church. That's more, me. That was, I think the Catholic Church is a beautiful expression of Christianity in many ways. So I would go to church, but in that tradition, by the time you're 14, you're confirmed, and that's the last I saw door, the church door. I would just argue with mom, didn't go, so mom ended up going off a lot by herself. My dad was not a practicing faith kind of guy, so I strayed away from my faith and got real interested in the Beatles. And I learned to play the guitar. And so my new religion became the Beatles. I would be the next John Lennon, and started getting into rock and roll music. Really, yes, there I am, still playing music. A little different audience, but yes, still playing. But yeah, I really got into my music, and my goal was to get through high school and then to go and travel and play music. I was in bands growing up. I was 17 and out till 2 a.m. in the morning playing in clubs. So, I had a trajectory. Well, I was raised by immigrants. An immigrant, when you're the first generation American, you don't do that. You go to college. Oh, Lord. So my goal was to hit college and flunk out my first semester. Again, still no faith involved in this. So I went and I actually enjoyed college, believe that. And probably what I enjoyed, I got involved with a fraternity and had quite a fraternity life. In fact, I think the house used in Animal House was the same chapter of my fraternity. So it gives you an idea what kind of group I was with.
Good, godly young men.
I met a young woman who was a fallen away Methodist. So now you've got a fallen away Catholic falling in love with a fallen away Methodist. And the two of us got together. And we lived in D.C. And eventually we ended up, we were married and we're living in a small town in western Pennsylvania called Blairsville. Okay. Now my wife dealt with a lot of family issues. Her mother's an alcoholic. Well, I came home, and at this point I had been running my own IT business. I was an IT consultant. I came home after a long day, and there she was laying on the floor, crying, dishes broken everywhere. She just had a really bad conversation, and she said, I'm done. And she said, life has to change. I said, okay. And she said, I went and talked to the minister across the street. We lived right across the street from a Roman Catholic church. Now, my wife wasn't Catholic. Why she went there, I have no idea. She said, I said, oh, okay. And I was a great evangelist. I'm like, well, that's good for you, honey. I'm glad you're doing that. Right? I'm not doing that. That's superstition that my Italian grandmother talks about. I'm not going to that stuff. And she said, I talked to Father Chet, who, God rest his soul. This man, he was a saint. He is a saint. And I said, okay, Father Chet was a big, heavy Roman Catholic priest. Reminds you of the stories of like Chaucer. He liked to drink his wine, eat his food, but he was in love with Jesus. He was in love with Jesus. So I said, oh, I'm glad you and Father talked. Are you okay? She goes, Father, I told Father I want to join the church. And I said, well, why would you want to do that? I've been a Catholic my whole life. There's nothing over there you get. And she said, no, I'm going to join. Again, real evangelist, right? And I said, well, you go ahead and do what you want, honey. I'll support you. She goes, well, you got to do more than support me. Father Chet said, you need to come over to church. I'm like, so I'm getting angry. Who is this fat priest telling me I need to be involved in my faith life? So I go over there. I had spent about a semester and a half at American University studying philosophy. So I'm going to go over there and show him how Christianity is nothing but a bunch of foolishness. So I sit down. They have these meetings where new members join, and I'm sitting there, and I'm, the typical not really interested believer. And I start throwing out these things, and Father Chet starts talking about Augustine and Augustine's philosophy, Aquinas and Aquinas' philosophy, and St. Anselm, and all these philosophers and Christian thinkers. And I'm like, wait, I thought these guys were all superstitious Bible thumpers. What are you getting at? And I fell in love right there with the intellectual tradition of the Roman Catholic Church. And it was in that church that I really had that new experience. And I was baptized as a young baby, but now I came to a real awareness of Christ in my life. And I remember I was praying at a chapel. They had a beautiful chapel, and the Eucharist was there, and I'm praying. And it just overwhelmed me that I was so lost and so willing to give up something that was so beautiful and powerful in my life. And I remember crying there. And then I went to confession the next day, and it had been like 11, 12 years. And Father Chet gave me absolution. And man, I was on fire with Jesus at that point. I joined the choir, guitar in the choir. I think my wife, she did like a 180. She didn't know what hit her. She wanted me to go to church, and then I ended up wanting to just live at church. And I got real interested, and I asked Father Chet. At that time, they were starting something called the permanent diaconate in the Roman Catholic Church. If you were a married man, you could get ordained. I just happened to live in one of two dioceses in the United States where they didn't have it. So he said, you should go to seminary anyway. So he got me connected with the Benedictine Seminary, St. Vincent's in Latrobe. It is the oldest Benedictine monastery in the United States. And I studied with the monks there. I became an oblate, it's a lay person who commits to living the spirituality and follows the rule of St. Benedict. So when you had Bishop Misael on, man, I was in love with that, right? That's right up my alley. I'm kind of a monk in my own world in some ways. And I just kept falling in love with the Lord, and I kept calling him, call me to ministry. Well, I went through, they finally bring the diaconate in. I had my master's degree. I did 2 years of formation to be ordained a deacon, and finished my PhD at the same time. And the bishop there said, we want you guys to wait 2 years. I was like, 2 more years. Well, then I ended up moving to Virginia Beach, where I am now. And so what do you do when you're on fire for the Lord and you're in Virginia Beach? You find the church. I got connected with the church. I am the bishop of Virginia, of the Southern Virginia, needed a diocesan theologian and an ecumenical officer. I sent my paperwork in. He called me up. So I ended up working for the bishop here in both those roles. I know it's crazy. In this process, I got assigned to one of the only parishes in, I think, the United States, and maybe one of 2 in the world, where it's an Episcopalian and Roman Catholic parish. Both of those denominations work together. They have a minister from each one. Well, the Roman Catholic priest is gone, and they needed someone to fill in, so they asked me as a lay minister to fulfill that work as in ministry. And I loved it. It was wonderful work. We'd have a visiting priest on Sundays, but I would do all the work with people throughout the week. One of those people that came was a Navy chaplain with his family called Diego Londoño, and any of them in the CEEC, Father Diego.
That's
and he and I
right.
struck up a friendship, and we started talking. And I always would share with him about my desire to be in ministry, and he talked to me about his past. And one day we're sitting there talking, and he said to me, "Do you ever read the parable of they bury the gifts?" And I said, "Yeah." He goes, "You're doing that, Dominick. If you really want to pursue ministry, yeah, there's Father Diego and his son and daughter there, Cassandra and Victor." He said, "If you really want to pursue ministry, I can introduce you to my bishop in the CEEC, and you guys can have that conversation." And that's what had happened after some time. Because of my background, I was required to do spiritual discernment with Father Diego for about a year, and I was ordained in November. I became a priest in the communion. So that's how I got here.
Oh, that's amazing. And we were looking at a few pictures of your church a little bit ago, and there's Father Diego, Father Benjamin, who's also a military chaplain.
Yep.
Both of these guys were with us down at our synod last year, and God's just using them. Hey, there you are with your guitar.
Yeah, that's so our Christmas service. So the church group is called Emmaus Fellowship. It's part of my From Emmaus to Jerusalem ministries. And we named it Emmaus Fellowship because, its mission is to encounter people where they at in word and sacrament, and have them make that turnaround to go from Emmaus, something where nobody knows anything about, to Jerusalem. And Jerusalem, as you know, means new peace, and to find that new peace in Christ. So we meet in my house, and we get people from all over here, and we do a bunch of things. There we are making lunches for a ministry here called Blankets for the Homeless. We try and plug in where we can. So we're not necessarily a church. We call ourselves a fellowship, just like instead of a denomination, we're a communion. This is one of my favorite. We helped here. This is the church is in Colombia. Father Diego is from Colombia, so my heart went out to those folks there, and through the bishop at the time who was doing work there. So our group would collect money and send it out there for the churches they were planting. And Archbishop, you know more than I do that this is not uncommon in the CEEC. Correct?
No, it's not. We have a lot of folks who are donating money to missions work overseas. There's some folks, like with your fellowship, sending it directly. Some folks sending it through the office of the General Secretary. And I think one of the things that I really would like people to know is that when money comes in for missions to the office of the General Secretary, it gets sent out in full. So, for example, we had someone give us $5,000 to put a well in at Nabia Pai in South Sudan. And the cost to get those $5,000 over to South Sudan was about $65 or $70, right around there, I think. But the communion paid that, so the entire gift was able to go and do the work it was sent for. And so the church as a whole, our communion, is just really dedicated to missions and supporting work. And just in these last few weeks, dealing with the COVID-19 crisis, we had literally thousands and thousands of dollars coming into the General Secretary's office and going out to not just CEEC churches, because we're about building a kingdom, not about building a communion. So we sent money to unrelated ministries in Israel. We sent monies to Mexico. We sent monies to just about 20% of the money. I think it was 20%, maybe 25, but at least 20 went to non-CEC ministries. So we were helping the body as a whole. And then we were sending gifts to our churches in Pakistan and in Kenya and in South Sudan and Uganda and Ghana, and it was going all over the place, and Mexico, and just doing so much good work. We were getting pictures back, many of them posted on our website, of people having received bags of food, having received envelopes with cash to pay some other bills. I mean, it was amazing to watch the impact the coronavirus had on people and their desire to give, even in the midst of all the question marks. And well, even at Regent's graduation for 2020 was kind of made into an online event.
Yep.
But that did open the door for about 50,000 people to attend virtually, and a lot of good graduates this year. What do you see in today's graduates when you compare them to graduates from 5 or 10 years ago? What's the comparison there?
Yeah, I mean, so I've been blessed, to be able to work at a Christian university, and honestly, Regent is a fantastic place. I can't say enough good things about our student body. We're not a big sports place, right? Mm-hmm. Now we are at a beach, so people do like that about it. But we get serious academic students who truly are on fire for the Lord. They really are. And our young people, and I've been there 11 years, and actually, I haven't seen a difference. I've just seen a continued increase in the quality and caliber. So, I mentioned that blankets for the homeless. That's a young woman who is a Regent graduate who started this ministry when she was in high school. She feeds hundreds and hundreds of people. She takes blankets, she gives tents, she cares for the homeless in the whole Hampton Roads area. That's typical of our graduates.
Wow.
They go on mission work. They're just really on fire for the Lord. So, it is a blessing to be there. I'm inspired. I always say that I'm very inspired by our young people. I'm just sure every college can say that, but when I see the people who graduate from Regent, they feel a calling, a vision, a purpose. They know God has called them to something. And one of my roles as the faculty there is to help them, again, discern, to hear that voice and do what God's calling them, to do what God's calling them to do. So it is a great experience.
Oh, that's so encouraging to hear how godly men and women are building into the lives of godly students so they grow into godly men and women and continue to have the impact. Let's come back to the issues that we're facing today, but from a bit of a different perspective, not the perspective of psychology, but the perspective of leadership. And I want to go to one of the questions we received from one of our viewers right now. The question was, what can we do as a church, collectively, capital C church, to address hate and violence in all groups, not just in one group? But how do we pull the church together to be a force for love?
It's the easiest but hardest thing in the world you can do. Live the gospel, right? I don't have to give you much more. Live the gospel. You can't tell me anyone who is seriously in love with Jesus Christ can go off and be bigoted and hateful intentionally. Our sin nature will always have some aspect of it to it, but to intentionally do that, you can't tell me that the gospel doesn't challenge you to live differently. And really, that's it. So why isn't the church doing that is the bigger question. I'll be honest with you. That's my question all the time. And it's because each individual church feels compelled out of selfishness to create their own vision. And that goes back to leadership, right? What is a good leader? One who casts a vision and communicates that vision to the people of that organization and inspires them, doesn't force them or command them, but inspires them to pick that vision up and run with it. Why isn't the church doing that? Because if I do that too much, that means I have to give up part of my real estate here to this other church. This is one of the things I fell in love with about the communion. And you said it yourself, Archbishop, 20% of the stuff you bring in doesn't even go to CEC communions. And that's kind of what I echo in our Emmaus Fellowship. I connect with churches all over Virginia Beach. People will come and I'll pastor them and minister to them. And when they need something more, I invite them to go to some other churches that I know are good Bible preaching, excellent churches. I partner with that church that I was doing work with as a Roman Catholic minister. We give them food constantly for their food bank. Why should I set up a food bank of my own when other people are doing it well? Why should other churches have to set up small groups where there's intimate encounters with Christ when Father Dominick has this thing going over there in Virginia Beach that our members can be a part of? Right?
Yeah, but are you going to get the credit for that if it's not your program with your name and your logo?
Archbishop, if I'm getting credit for anything, it's the sin, it's the fault, it's all the things that I'm doing wrong, right? Anything that's good isn't me anyway. It's our Lord Jesus Christ working through every minister I've ever met.
Yeah.
I haven't met a minister who, in himself or herself, has done anything good.
I just wanted to push up this picture because it's you ministering in a seniors community up there in Virginia Beach. I know Father Chris Turner is going to appreciate this, and Father Richard Smith is going to appreciate this because they're doing similar things down here in the Florida area. But this is a great example of pouring into the lives of people who, in many ways, are not going to be able to pour back into your life. But it's giving, like the Lord said, to those who cannot repay you.
And actually, Bishop, I think I am ministered to more when I'm there than I minister to them. These are men and women who have walked with the Lord for 70, 80 years. Talk about wisdom and discernment. They have known what it's like to survive wars. They've known what it's like to lose a spouse. They know what it's like to lose the children, to deal with their own illnesses. I'm a 54-year-old, and I'm still going to say young, 54-year-old young man who I haven't had those tragedies. And so when I encounter them, you talk about that sacred space. When I come into that sacred space and I encounter them and we sit and we talk about whatever they're dealing with, I'll tell you what, good brother, I'm ministered to. The Holy Spirit working through them seeing the Christ in their cross, them seeing redemption in the burden they carry. I mean, no, it's a gift to me, and I'm so grateful that I got asked to participate there. I give them nothing. I'm present. They give back to me, and I appreciate that.
Wow. Well, coming around full circle on this question of how do we address hate and violence, and you said it's the gospel. And, I shared with you earlier my adventures in Israel, and I don't talk about this much, but there was an afternoon I was sitting up on the Mount of Olives, and I was in a special park there where we would film some programs for different broadcasts and things like that. And the person I was sitting there with, not too many years earlier, had been the driver, and let's put that in quotes, the driver for Yasser Arafat. And part of his duties as drivers was breaking people's knees sometimes, was a little encouragement to fall into line in various physical ways with different weapons, and very, very violent individual. But somebody shared the gospel in a way that he couldn't avoid. They shared it by building a relationship. They shared it by establishing trust and love. And that man came to Christ.
Amen.
That man ended up leaving that employer and going to Jericho and starting a ministry that is building bridges between Arabs and Israelis. He hated Israelis. He hated Israel. And yet when God touched his heart, God took away the hate.
Amen.
And so the only way we're going to overcome hate and violence in whatever group we're talking about, whether it's, we don't have time, we've got 15 minutes left in the program to start listing all the groups, but the answer is Jesus. The answer is Jesus changing your heart, and then you're not going to hate. Like you're saying, you can't have a living, vibrant relationship with Jesus and be bigoted and hateful and choose to walk in that way. I agree with you. I don't think it works that way. I think one of the two has to change. So, and
I would say this, it has to start with you. Mm-hmm. Don't look at someone else and say, you need to find Jesus. Stop and look at your own relationship and say, Lord, convict me of my relationship with you, that I can be that example
That's
for
right.
other people to look.
And now we're talking about living the power. We've identified the truth. We've overcome the lie. Now we're living the power, and that's the aspect of the Holy Spirit working in us. I've got to go back. Somebody popped up a statement on the website. We were talking about you going and being part of the food bank and stuff like that. And they said it's amazing what can be accomplished when people don't care who gets the credit. Well, we were just working. You probably saw the 24 hours of prayer for Muslims on the night of power in Ramadan, and there were so many different groups that came together and did that. But in our meetings, in our planning meetings, we were talking about no egos, no logos, as long as the gospel goes. That's the key thing. So let's keep talking about living the power in the last few minutes we've got together. You have some books that I want to make sure people know about. We've got this one on living the spiritual life, finding God in the everyday, which is talking about sitting out in the yard there and reacting to people as they're coming down the street. And you've got another book, The Christian Vocation of Forgiveness. Talk to us a little bit about that in light of what we're going through in our country right now.
Yeah, so the premise of the book is, if you call yourself a Christian, then immediately part of your vocation is to foster forgiveness. We are living agents of God's forgiveness, of God's love. So what the book does, it kind of gives you some biblical perspective of what forgiveness is. And it also looks at the early church and what the early church has always talked about and how they lived a life of forgiveness. And then ultimately it draws on the psychological theory and helps you build a daily practice to deepen your level of forgiveness. Forgiveness is not something you do once. It's a process that goes on in your life continually. Forgiveness is not how you feel about something. It's a choice you make. It's interesting that forgiveness and love are so similar, right? Both of them are not emotions. They are choices we make. And that means they have to be worked through and worked out. So that book is the fruit of some work I've done in my own counseling business, helping people develop that as part of who they are, particularly if they call themselves Christians. I've lost your volume, Archbishop.
That's because while I had your picture on the screen, I turned my microphone off so I could cough.
Yeah,
and now everybody knows, so I should have just left the microphone on. I started to say, you're referring a lot to church fathers in early history and giving of your answers. And Father Roger LeBlanc up in Canada has asked you to talk about, have you studied Ignatian spirituality at all? And can you just briefly discuss Ignatian and Benedictine spirituality? Because we've already referred to Father Misael, Bishop Misael, and the...
So I am not a huge Ignatius or Jesuit individual. I was never drawn to it, but I did, of course, have to study it as far as discernment, because you can't study and think about spiritual discernment without looking at Ignatius. Lots of people ask me, have you ever gone on the Ignatius retreat? I've never done any of that. So my knowledge of Ignatian spirituality is pure heady. I am, at the deepest core of who I am, Benedictine in my spirituality. That everydayness of life, finding the sacred and making the meals and doing the things like Bishop Misael talked about, that's more where my direction goes. Mm-hmm. But definitely an awesome resource for discernment. Yep, definitely.
Yep. Great, thank you. You said spirituality is not just saying to somebody else, you need to find Jesus. You said it's looking at yourself and dealing with yourself. How can we identify and overcome the lies in our own lives?
You need to set up a daily routine. Maybe this is the Benedictine coming out of me, right? You need to set up a daily routine. So you need to find that time to step back. Now, Archbishop, you have promoted this because it's strong in the Anglican tradition. It's very Benedictine, and the biggest way to do that is liturgically. So don't you pick and choose what you want to read from the Bible. Don't pick and choose the theme for the day. Liturgically follow the calendar, and the best way you can do that individually and in a daily ritual is through the office, right? Mm-hmm. The divine office. So in the Book of Common Prayer, People always say, what's your two most influential books in your life? I said, well, I have three: the Book of Common Prayer, the Bible, and the Rule of St. Benedict. But yes, you need to set aside that time and allow the liturgy, the Word of God, through that tradition, to convict you. And as it convicts you, allow it to transform you. And then when you go out and live that life, it's different. I have heard people say, one of the things I don't like about liturgical church is you guys every year kind of do the same thing over and over again. I said, that's because you only see it as a circle, but it's actually a funnel that just keeps spinning down deeper and deeper. So that gospel I read on the first Sunday of Advent 2 years ago is a very different gospel to me
That's
the next
right.
coming year.
And one of the things we've all seen as we're reading the scriptures is you're reading, you're reading a verse, you're reading a chapter that you've read a dozen times before, and all of a sudden you stop and you say, wait a minute, when did God put that verse in there?
Yeah.
But so, hey, listen, I just want to do a little promo here. Daily Office. We've got links on the CEEC.church website to multiple places where you can get the daily office, multiple places where you can enter into the rhythm of the church. Rhythms and patterns are part of who we are, and when we make those patterns part of our spirituality, it strengthens us. What is it? You're talking about being involved with people, and you were talking also about listening and making sure you're not just talking. Talk to us a little bit. One of the questions we got was, what does it look like in everyday life to listen to the wounded?
To listen to the wounded. I discovered one of the most healing things that any human being can do for another human being is just be present, right? Just be present. And it really requires you to have that discipline of not always just wanting to say something, right? Again, I'm going to credit my monastic formation and actually my background as a therapist as well. One of the things you're taught is to be comfortable in that silence, right? And so when you go to the wounded and you're quiet and you give them that space, let them be angry with God, let them be sad, right? Don't feel like you've got to get in there and give them an answer. In fact, I would say that's the wrong thing to do. It really actually requires you to bring your presence and absorb what they have. That's not easy. I think anyone that goes into spiritual direction or counseling, pray for those souls. Really do pray for those souls, because they spend hours absorbing other people's junk. And then they have to find a way to release it on their own. So it's not an easy process, but I would also say it's probably one of the most fulfilling things a human being can do for another human being. And again, going back to the situation, one of the things that makes me most angry is we are not letting the hurt voices speak and absorb it. And only once we have heard it and absorbed it do we know what to do with it, right? I mean, if our first reaction when someone says, Black Lives Matter, is to just yell back, all lives matter, you have not absorbed their pain. You've simply stated an alternative fact. And I would say if I'm in a neighborhood and my house is starting to burn, the first thing I don't yell is, all houses matter. The first thing I yell is, my house needs taken care of. And, if you step back, that's what these people are saying, right? Let the anger come. That's an example of what it means to be a listening, discerning soul who then takes that and does something with it.
Right. Look, pain hurts. You had to come here to hear it first, right? Pain hurts. And it can be tough to forgive offenses where you're still feeling the pain, or where the pain is being repeated over and over and over again. And our job as believers is not just to stop causing pain, but to be a vehicle of healing. I mean, talk to me. Why is it so easy to keep believing the lies we've been told and not embrace truth once we see it?
I think you know all these answers, Archbishop. You're just asking because you want to fill time.
No, I want people to hear from you. You've got a lot of expertise in this.
We can never fool ourselves. We have a proclivity towards sin and what they call it, concupiscence, right, in theological terms. And we love lies. And we love how they just twist things. And we love the darkness. And we will want to. And no believer can tell themselves they're beyond that. If they do, they lie. Because if you are without sin, then you're lying, right? If you say you're without sin. And I think it speaks to our our sin nature, our vices, we're drawn to it. And I tell a lot of my directees in spiritual direction, always remember this: vice comes naturally. Anger, hatred, bigotry, that comes naturally. It's easy to do. Virtue takes work, right? And that requires the gift of grace, the willingness to step back, and to then do something that's not easy.
Great. Thank you. Listen, I'm getting multiple questions. Where do we get the books? Okay, so here's one of the books: The Christian Vocation of Forgiveness, Living a Life of Peace and Grace, and Father Dominick's other book, Short Essays on the Spiritual Life, or how you can find God in the everyday. We have put links to these books on Amazon down in the comments of this program. And so you can get them there, but you can also go to Amazon.com. Full disclosure, we're not making any money on the books. We're not getting a cut because you clicked on the link on our Facebook page. We're just helping Father Dominick get this done. Listen, we've got a couple minutes left. Let me ask you, give us a bit of clinical expertise here. When does someone, believer or not, need to recognize that an issue in their life is bigger than them and decide to get some professional help?
Yeah, that's that pain threshold, right? And we're amazing at what pain we will tolerate, right? We're amazing at what pain we tolerate. So it's just a matter of each individual's pain threshold. And sometimes what you do in therapy isn't necessarily wait for them to hit that pain threshold, but you give them a clear understanding of, what pain they're in. And I'll give you a lot of this is when I do marriage counseling. The couple will come in, the wife is distraught, and the husband's like, I don't know what the problem is, right? And so I will have him look at his wife and say, here is a fellow human being in agony because of the way you're treating her, the things you're saying, and not even acknowledging it. Are you the kind of human being that's cruel enough to want to do that to someone else? That usually gets their attention.
Wow.
And I say, you can be honest with me. I'm not judging you. If you want to be that kind of person, that's your choice. But some tells me, because most human beings don't want to do that to another human being unless and there are some that have, I hate to say that, they have clinical problems. But most will say, I see what you mean, right? I don't want to hurt that other person. And thinking about me hurting that other person hurts me. So you've just got to be very skilled to help people realize, look at the pain. Forgiveness is another one. People will say, I don't need to forgive that person. I don't care for that SOB anymore. I'm like, so How does that impact that relationship? Because what it'll do is, so how are you treating other people? And then you point out to them, by not being forgiving, you take out that anger, frustration in your other relationships. In fact, one of the main reasons non-believers pursue forgiveness is because it heals other relationships and opens their heart to love people that they weren't able to love before.
Right. Yeah. It's been said, refusing to forgive is like drinking poison till the other guy dies.
Got it.
Yeah. If you're struggling in your marriage, and I'll tell you, when I did my son's wedding January 1st this year, one of the things I said was, if you've been married more than a week, you know that there are struggles in a marriage. Every marriage goes through struggles, but it's never too late to live happily ever after. And if your marriage is struggling, you need to find a counselor like Father Dominick or somebody else who can help you, or look at the Alpha Marriage Course, which is a great place to find some stuff. All right, 60 seconds left, Father Dominick. What's the unasked question? What did you want us to ask you, but we didn't?
What's the unasked question? Perhaps is what you folks can do for me. And I'll tell you what I need. I need continued prayer. I wasn't kidding when I said I fight with God. Sometimes when you spend a lot of time in education, you fill your head with things that cause a lot of doubt. So pray for people like me and other men and women doing what I do in higher education, that we can stay faithful to Christ. Because that's one of our biggest challenges, to be honest with you.
Excellent.
Staying the course when your head is filled with a lot of information.
Well, Father Dominick, this has been an amazing hour. And the words at the beginning were prophetic. Buckle up. We've talked about hatred and racism and bad marriages and forgiveness and discernment and truth and lies. And I'll tell you, if you didn't find something in this program to make you smile and to make you mad, you just weren't paying close enough attention. So thanks for being such a great guest. It was an honor and a privilege to have you. I just want to let you know that next week you do not want to miss the program. Our guest is going to be Dr. Brian Hickox, and we're going to be talking about touching persecuted Christians. Brian has been working with Christians in the persecuted church in many, many ways. The CEEC has been helping behind the scenes and been involved with that through the Jesus Alliance. And we're going to talk about a couple of really exciting things that are going on, and you just don't want to miss it. So make sure you're here next week, 7 o'clock. I want to thank you for joining us and ask God's blessing on you. Keep pressing on. Take hold of that for which Christ Jesus took hold of you.